The first thing Norah Petersen noticed about the man was his hands. Not his face, not the truck he drove, not even the fact that he was 40 minutes late and she had been standing outside the Kamloops feed store in the October cold long enough for her fingers to go numb. She noticed his hands because when he finally pulled up and stepped out, he did not say hello or sorry or anything at all. He just walked around to the truck bed, lifted a 60-pound salt block like it was a dictionary, and set it down with the kind of ease that comes from 20 years of doing something without thinking about it. His hands were the hands of a man who had never once treated them carefully. She had driven 4 hours from Edmonton to meet a ranch she had never seen, and a man she had only spoken to twice on the phone. She thought, standing there in the cold, that she had made a serious error in judgment. She was wrong about that, but it would take an entire autumn to find out exactly how wrong. Norah Petersen was 37 years old, a water rights lawyer from Edmonton with a reputation for being precise, prepared, and difficult to surprise. She had grown up in Red Deer, the daughter of a crop farmer who had taught her that land does not forgive carelessness, and neither should you. She had spent 15 years in Edmonton making herself useful to people who owned large pieces of Alberta and needed someone to protect them from people who wanted to take those pieces away. She was good at her job. She was also, by the accounting of 2 former partners and 1 former fiancé, not easy to live with. The fiancé had lasted 3 years. He was a contractor, pleasant, steady, and deeply uncomfortable with the fact that Norah earned more than he did, had stronger opinions than he did, and was constitutionally incapable of pretending otherwise. When he left, he said she was intimidating. Norah did not argue. She had worked hard at it. At 37, she was not looking for anything. She was looking for land. Her uncle Gus had died the previous spring and left her a quarter section in the BC interior that she had not known existed. She drove out to see it in June and found a property that had been neglected for a decade. Good bones, rough fencing, creek running through it, south-facing slopes that a person with patience could do something with. She was not a rancher. But she was her father's daughter, and her father's daughter does not look at viable land and walk away. She needed someone to assess the cattle operation, evaluate the existing stock, and give her an honest picture of what she was actually holding. A colleague gave her a name, Stuart McKinnon, third-generation rancher out of the Nicola Valley, ran his family's place solo since his father died, knew more about British Columbia rangeland than anyone her colleague had ever met. Not easy to reach, her colleague said. Not easy to work with either, to be honest. But if he tells you something, it's true. Norah called the number. It rang 11 times before anyone answered. The voice on the other end was flat and unhurried, the voice of a man who had decided long ago that whoever was calling could wait. She explained what she wanted. There was a silence that lasted long enough that she checked her phone to see if the call had dropped. Then he said, "I can look at it. Give me a date." That was the whole conversation. He did not ask about the property. He did not ask about her. He gave her a time and a place and hung up, and Norah stared at her phone for a moment and then put it in her bag, because that was apparently what passed for an intake meeting in the Nicola Valley. The second call, 2 weeks later, was shorter. And now here she was, standing outside a feed store in Kamloops with numb fingers, watching Stuart McKinnon carry salt blocks without acknowledging her existence. He finally turned around. He was not what she had pictured from the voice on the phone. She had pictured someone older, softer, the kind of weather that comes with some warmth underneath it. What she got was a man in his early 40s, lean in the way that comes from actual physical work and not from a gym, with dark hair going gray at the temples and the expression of someone who was tolerating the present moment rather than participating in it. He had mud on his jacket. He was wearing the same jacket he would wear every single day for the next 6 weeks, and she did not know that yet, but she would come to know it the way you come to know a person's handwriting. He looked at her. He said, "Norah." Not a question, a confirmation. She said, "You're late." He said, 45 minutes. "I had a heifer go down this morning." He said it the way you say the sun came up. A fact, offered without apology because it had not occurred to him that an apology was the appropriate response to a fact. Norah looked at him and thought, this man is going to be insufferable. She was wrong about that too, but it would take longer to find out. The drive to the property took an hour and 40 minutes, and Stuart McKinnon said approximately 60 words for the duration of it. Norah had prepared questions, organized, specific, the kind of questions you bring to a first sight assessment. She asked the first one and he answered it in one sentence. She asked the second and he said he'd have to see the place first. She asked the third and he said nothing at all, just lifted his chin slightly at the window, and she realized he was pointing at something, a hawk riding a thermal above the highway's edge. A rough-legged hawk, she would later learn. He named it when she asked. He did not volunteer the name. He was not a man who volunteered. She spent the rest of the drive looking out her own window and cataloging in her head the ways this arrangement was going to be difficult. The silence, the apparent inability to treat a professional engagement as a professional engagement, the mud on the jacket, the 45-minute delay that had not, in his mind, required an apology. She thought, I am paying this man for his expertise, and he is treating me like a minor weather event. She thought. I will get what I need from him and be back in Edmonton by Thursday. She thought a lot of things on that drive that she would later be ashamed of, and she did not share any of them, because Norah Petersen was self-aware enough to know that some thoughts should be kept as drafts. The property was better than she remembered from June, and worse in other ways. Stuart got out of the truck and did not wait for her. He walked the fence line at a pace she had to work to match, stopping occasionally to crouch down and look at something. Soil, root structure, a gate hinge that had been wrong for years. He did not explain what he was looking at. He just looked and she watched him look, and she began to understand that she was not going to get a running commentary. She was going to get a report at the end. They walked for 3 hours. He said perhaps 200 words. She said more, asking questions he sometimes answered and sometimes didn't, and she gradually stopped asking and started watching. Because watching him assess that land was actually more informative than the answers she was getting. He knew things. That was the first thing she understood. Not the performed knowledge of a consultant who has read the reports. The actual embodied knowledge of someone who had spent 40 years being wrong and learning from it. He crouched next to a dry creek bed and explained, without being asked, why it had dried up, and what would happen to the south pasture if it stayed that way. He looked at a stand of lodgepole pine near the upper fence and told her how long they had been stressed and why, and what that meant for erosion in the next 5 years. He picked up a handful of soil and described it with the casual accuracy of someone reading their own handwriting. She had brought a legal pad. She started taking notes. He noticed. He said nothing about it. On the drive back to Kamloops, something had shifted, though she couldn't have said exactly what. She asked him how long it would take to get the operation viable, by which she meant profitable, by which she meant the language of investment she understood. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet before he said something he had actually thought about. Then he said, "Depends what you want it to be," she said. "Productive," he said. "For cattle 5 years, maybe 4 if the water situation sorts itself. For a different use, hay, guest operation, leasing grazing rights to a neighbor, could be shorter. Depends whether you want a ranch or you want an asset." She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the highway. She said, "What's the difference?" He said, "A ranch you stay. An asset you visit." She did not have an answer to that. She was not accustomed to not having answers. She wrote it on her legal pad anyway. The arrangement as she had understood it was 1 week. 1 site assessment, 1 report, done. She would go back to Edmonton and make a decision about what to do with the property. Stuart would go back to the Nicola Valley, and whatever it was he did there that didn't involve talking. That was not what happened. The report he sent her was 14 pages, handwritten, with a map he had drawn himself of the water table and what he called the real property. Meaning not the legal boundaries but the land as it actually functioned, where it was soft, where it would freeze, where the grass came back and where it didn't, and why. She had expected a 3-page summary with a recommendation and a bill. She sat at her kitchen table in Edmonton and read all 14 pages twice. Then she called him. He picked up on the 7th ring. She said she wanted to bring in a hydrologist to look at the creek bed, and she wanted to know if he had someone he trusted. He gave her a name. She said she also wanted him to come back when the hydrologist was there, because she had questions about the upper fence line he hadn't answered in the report. There was a pause. She waited. He said he could come the following Friday if the weather held. That visit became a 2nd week. The 2nd week became a 3rd. She started driving out from Edmonton on Thursdays. The 7-hour drive she had initially considered an obstacle, she came to consider something else. A transition. The drive that separated the part of her life that was arguments about water allocation, from the part of her life that was different and harder to name. They worked together with the kind of friction that is, in retrospect, not friction at all, but 2 people who think at the same speed, discovering they disagree on almost everything and finding that disagreeable. She thought the south pasture should be prioritized. He thought the creek was the priority without which the pasture didn't matter. She thought the existing fence line could be salvaged with repair. He said tearing it out and starting over was cheaper in the long run. She ran the numbers on her laptop at the kitchen table of her uncle's old cabin and told him he was wrong. He looked at the numbers. He said the numbers were missing a variable and told her what it was. She looked at where he was pointing. She adjusted the spreadsheet. The number changed. She said, "You could have said that differently." He said, "How?" She said, "With some indication that you understood I might have a perspective worth considering before you told me I was wrong." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Your perspective was worth considering. That's why I looked at your numbers instead of just telling you I disagreed." She stared at him. He went back to his coffee. She thought, sitting there, that she had never in 15 years of professional life met a man who was more infuriating and more difficult to dismiss. Not because he was aggressive, he wasn't. Because he was consistent. He said what he thought. He listened when she pushed back on his head, and he changed his position when she was right, and didn't change it when she wasn't, and he did not once soften either response to make her feel better. She was not accustomed to that. The men she had worked with in Edmonton were either deferential or territorial. Stuart Mackinnon was neither. He was just present, fully and without performance, in a way that required her to be present the same way. She found it exhausting. She also found herself driving out on Thursdays and not checking what time she left. The question Norah had never asked herself, the one that had ended 2 partnerships and 1 almost marriage, was, can I be known and still be safe? She did not phrase it that way. She would have said she valued independence. She would have said she had learned not to rely on people who would eventually require her to be smaller than she was. Both of those things were true, and neither of them was the whole truth. She arrived at the property every Thursday braced for the moment. Stuart would do what they all eventually did. Tell her, directly or indirectly, that her intelligence was attractive in small doses and exhausting in practice. She waited for him to defer to her opinion when he thought she was wrong. The polite kind of condescension she had learned to recognize immediately. She waited for the look that men gave her when she contradicted them in front of others. None of it came. When she was wrong, he told her. When she was right, he said so without making it sound like a compliment. When she took over the project management spreadsheet, because his system was, generously speaking, a series of paper scraps held together by optimism, he handed her the whole thing without comment, and asked her to include a column for weather delays, because he always forgot to account for them. She included the column. The system became better. He did not feel diminished by this, because it had not occurred to him that it should diminish him. One afternoon in November, a neighboring rancher named Doug Telfer stopped by to look at a fence line they shared. He was friendly, gregarious, the kind of man who fills a room with words. He talked to Stuart for 10 minutes about cattle prices, and talked to Norah for approximately 40 seconds before he turned back to Stuart and asked him what his wife thought about the creek situation. Stuart said, "She's the one managing it. Ask her." Telfer turned back to Norah with the expression of a man recalibrating. She answered his question. He listened. He asked a follow-up. The conversation that followed lasted 20 minutes and he left having learned something. Norah watched his truck go down the drive and said nothing. Stuart poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the porch rail near her hand. She said, "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she said. "You know for what," he said. "Telfer's not a bad man. He just hasn't updated his assumptions. Most people don't unless something makes them." She looked at him. He picked up his coffee and went back inside, because that was the thing about Stuart Mackinnon. He said the most disarming things in the tone of someone reading a weather forecast, and then he left you alone with them. She stood on the porch for a long time after that. November in the Nicola Valley is not a gentle month. The cold comes in from the north with the efficiency of something that has been doing this for 10,000 years and sees no reason to be polite about it. The roads ice before dawn and stay that way until noon, and sometimes don't thaw at all. The light goes flat and gray by 3 in the afternoon. It is the kind of month that tells you what a piece of land is actually made of, because everything non-essential strips away, and what's left is structure. Norah had driven out on a Thursday in late November, later than she intended because a hearing had run long. She arrived past dark, which she had done before, and she went straight to the cabin and started the wood stove, and was working through emails, when Stuart's truck came down the drive at 9:30 in the evening, which was not something she had expected. He knocked. He said through the door that the creek was going to freeze overnight, and if she wanted to get the readings the hydrologist had asked for, they needed to do it now. She said, "It's 9:30, he said. "The creek doesn't know that." She put on her coat and her headlamp and went out into the dark. They worked along the creek in the cold for 2 hours, taking readings at the markers the hydrologist had set up. And they talked more in those 2 hours than they had in most daylight sessions. Not about the property. She asked him, at some point, why he had stayed in the Nicola Valley after his father died, when his sister had moved to Vancouver and his brother had gone east, and there had been every opportunity to go with one of them. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he hadn't heard her, or had chosen not to answer. Then he said, "The land knows me. Takes a long time for land to know you. I didn't want to start over." She stood there in the dark with her headlamp making a circle of gold on the ice at her feet. She said, "I think I understand that." He said, "I know you do. It's why you're here instead of hiring someone to manage it remotely." She had not said that out loud to anyone. She looked at him. In the dark and the cold, with their breath-making clouds, she realized that somehow, in 6 weeks of working alongside each other, this quiet and difficult man had seen her more clearly than people who had known her for years. She did not say anything. He said, "The upper marker is iced over. We should head back." They walked back to the cabin. He said goodnight and drove back down the road. And Norah stood in the cabin doorway and watched his taillights disappear into the dark, and felt something she had spent 15 years not feeling. Because it required a vulnerability she had decided she could not afford. She closed the door. She did not sleep well. The call came on a Tuesday morning in December, when Norah was in Edmonton, and the temperature at the property had dropped to -22 overnight. It was Stuart. He said the cabin's water line had frozen and burst during the night, and there was water damage to the kitchen wall and the subfloor near the sink. He had found it because he had driven over to check on the place, because he had been watching the forecast and he had known the line was under-insulated, and he had told her in October that it needed to be wrapped before the cold set in, and she had written it on the project list and it had not been done. He was not angry. He was not anything, in the tone that meant he was being careful. She said. Is it bad? He said. Could have been worse. I've got the water shut off. You'll need a plumber and probably a drywaller. I can give you names, she said. How long have you been there? He said. Since about 7. It was now 11:30. He had been there 4.5 hours in -22, dealing with a problem on her property that was not his responsibility, and he had called her to give her information, not to tell her what she had failed to do. She said. Stuart, he said. She said. Why didn't you remind me about the water line? In October, if you knew it needed to be done before the cold, why didn't you say so again? There was a silence. He said. Because you wrote it down. I figured you'd handle it when you were ready. She said. I forgot. I know. She said. You should have reminded me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said. Not unkindly, maybe, but I've found that reminding people of things they've already written down usually goes one of two ways. Either they already know and they resent it, or they didn't know and they feel bad. You're not someone who needs to feel bad about a mistake you'd have caught on your own if you'd had a slower week, so I didn't say it again. She sat at her kitchen table in Edmonton with the phone in her hand and the feeling that this man who never said more than necessary had just said exactly as much as necessary. She said, I'm driving out tomorrow. He said roads might be icy by Thursday. She said, I'll be careful. She drove out the next morning. She arrived to find the cabin warmer than she expected, which turned out to be because Stuart had come back with a space heater and run it overnight to keep the remaining pipes from freezing. He had not mentioned this on the phone. He had also not mentioned that he had done a temporary repair on the kitchen wall himself, the kind of stopgap work that would hold until the drywaller came, because he had decided it was something he could do, and so he had done it. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the repair. She said, You didn't have to do this. He was making coffee at the counter with his back to her. He said. It needed doing, she said. Stuart. He turned around. She said. I owe you about 40 hours of labor at this point, not counting the waterline situation, not counting driving out here in December in the middle of your own busy season. I don't know how to repay that and I am not comfortable not knowing. He looked at her for a long moment. He had the direct, unhurried gaze of a man who was actually listening to what you said and not preparing his response before you finished. He said. You're not in debt to me. I'm out here because I want to be, she said. Why? He said. Because the work is interesting, because the property is worth saving, because. He paused, and she saw something shift in his face, the barely perceptible shift of a man deciding to say the true thing. Because you ask the right questions. And the people who ask the right questions are not as common as they should be. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the snow was falling in the slow, unhurried way it falls in the interior when it intends to stay a while. Norah Petersen, who had spent 15 years making herself precise and prepared and difficult to surprise, was surprised. She said, I judged you in the first 5 minutes. Outside the feed store. I decided you were going to be impossible. He said, I know. She said you knew. He said, you stopped asking questions about 40 minutes into the first site walk. I figured either you'd decided I wasn't worth talking to or you were watching instead. I thought it was probably the second one. I was waiting to find out. She said, you were waiting. He said, I find that most things reveal themselves if you don't interrupt them. She looked at him. He handed her a coffee. She took it. The Nicola Valley winter does not shorten itself for anyone's convenience, and neither does the work of bringing a neglected property back to itself. They spent December and January and February doing the things that needed doing, in the particular rhythm that had developed between them. Her precision and his patience, her systems and his judgment, the arguments that were, in the retrospective accounting she did months later. Not arguments at all but the sound of two people who were paying attention. She did not go back to Edmonton in January. She told her office she was managing a property matter from site. Her office accepted this because she had been managing property matters reliably for 15 years and they trusted her to know what required her presence. She trusted herself to know too. She just did not say out loud, not yet, what kind of presence was required and why. In February, during a week when the cold relented long enough for the light to come back and stay past 4 in the afternoon, she and Stuart walked the whole property together for the first time since October. Not for assessment, just to see it. There was no legal pad. She did not take notes. They walked in the easy silence that had become, without her exactly deciding this, one of her favorite things about being in the Nicola Valley. At the south fence where the slope caught the light and the grass under the snow had that particular hum of land that wanted to be used, she said, I think I want to stay. He said, with the property, she said, and She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. He looked at the slope. He looked at her. I figured. She said when. He said, December. When you came back the day after the pipe burst. You didn't have to do that, she said. The property needed. He said, Norah. She stopped. He said, you came back because you wanted to. Same as I keep showing up. The property is the excuse, not the reason. The winter light was flat and clear and honest, the way light gets when there's nothing between you and it. She said, I spent a long time deciding not to need people. He said, I know. I spent a long time doing the same thing. Turns out the land needs tending and so do people, and it's about the same amount of work either way. She looked at him. He was watching a raven cross the south slope. Unhurried, purposeful, the only thing moving in all that white. She said, you could have said all of this 4 months ago. He said, you weren't ready to hear it 4 months ago. She thought about the feed store in October, the mud on his jacket, the 45-minute wait in the cold, the 10 words he'd said in the first hour, and the 12 pages he'd written afterward. She thought about all the things she had decided in the first 5 minutes that had taken the rest of the autumn to unsay. She said, I regret the first 5 minutes. He said, I don't. The first 5 minutes told me you paid attention to the wrong things. Took me about 6 weeks to show you the right one, she said. That's a generous interpretation. He said, it's an accurate one. She had to caught her, off guard, the laugh. She had not laughed like that, sudden and unguarded in a long time. They did not leave the Nicola Valley, not really, not for long. Norah restructured her practice to allow for remote work, which her clients found unconventional, and she found she did not care. Stewart's place was 20 minutes down the road, and they moved between the two properties with the unhurried logic of people who have decided that logistics are a problem for people who haven't made up their minds. The creek was restored in the 3rd year with the help of the hydrologist. And a provincial grant that Norah wrote the application for in 6 hours on a Friday morning, while Stewart fixed a tractor outside the window. The south pasture came back the following spring, greener than either of them had expected, because the land had been waiting longer than they'd known, and had opinions about what it could do if someone would just let it. They argued about the coffee, which was a constant and never resolved negotiation. They argued about fencing methodology and the correct way to manage a grazing rotation, and whether it was worth driving 40 minutes to the good hardware store, or 45 minutes to the slightly worse one closer. They did not argue about the things that had ended Norah's previous partnerships, because those arguments require one person to want the other to be less than they are. And Stuart Mackinnon did not have that particular appetite. He told her once when she asked that her precision was not intimidating to him. He said, precise people are easy to work with. It's the imprecise ones that are hard, because you spend all your time trying to figure out what they actually mean. She said. Most men I've worked with found it intimidating. He said. Most men you've worked with probably wanted you to be less precise so they could be more imprecise without it showing. She looked at him for a long moment. He went back to what he was doing. She never forgot that. Stuart Mackinnon is still in the Nicola Valley. Norah is still there too most of the time, and when she is not, she is on her way back. The property that Norah's uncle left her, the neglected quarter section that she had nearly listed with a real estate agent without ever visiting, is a working ranch now. Not large, not flashy, but sound. The kind of sound that comes from people who understand both the land and each other, and have decided not to cut corners on either. I think about that first afternoon sometimes. The feed store in Kamloops, the mud on the jacket, the 45 minutes in the cold, and the flat confirmation of a name, and not a word of apology, because to him there was nothing to apologize for, because the heifer had needed him and he had been there. I think about how Norah stood in that parking lot and made a decision about who he was in the time it takes to unload a salt block, and I think about how wrong she was, and how right she was to stay long enough to be wrong. The things we judge people for in the first minute are almost never the things that matter. The coat with the hole, the missing apology, the silences we fill with our own assumptions before the other person has had a chance to speak for themselves. We are all doing this all the time, and most of us never stay long enough in the cold to find out what we got wrong. But sometimes, if you're lucky, the land is worth saving, and so is the person standing on it, and all it takes is 1 week stretching into 6, and the patience to let something reveal itself instead of deciding what it is before it has the chance. Norah told me once that the best decision she ever made was the one she didn't make. The decision to leave that she kept putting off Thursday after Thursday until she stopped thinking of it as a decision at all. I think that's right. So I'll ask you what she asks herself sometimes, on the quiet evenings in the Nicola Valley when the light goes long and golden over the south slope and the land looks exactly like what it is. Have you ever misjudged someone so completely in the first minute that being wrong about them turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to you? Leave it in the comments. I read everyone.